Part 2, Chapter 10 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Gerald Moe. The Headhunters. Nature, so far, had been kind to Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones. No high winds or heavy seas had assailed him, and he had been upon the water for 3 days now. The wind had held steadily out of the south, varying but a few points during this time, but even so, Waldo Emerson was commencing to doubt and to worry. His supply of water was running dangerously low, his food supply would last but a few days longer, and as yet he had sighted no sail nor seen any land. Furthermore, he had not the remotest conception of how he might retrace his way to the island he had just quitted. He could only sail before the wind. Should the wind veer around into the north, he might, by chance, be blown back to the island. Otherwise, he could never reach it. And he was beginning to wonder if he had not been a trifle too precipitate in his abandonment of land. In common with most other landsmen, Waldo Emerson had little conception of the vastness of the broad reaches of unbroken water wildernesses that roll in desolate immensity over 3/4 of the globe. His recollection of maps pictured the calm and level blue dotted, especially in the South Seas, with many islands. Their names often were quite reassuring. He recollected, among others, such as the Society Islands, the Friendly Islands, Christmas Island. He hoped that he would land upon one of these. There were so many islands upon the maps, and they seemed so close together, that he was not a little mystified that he had failed to sight several hundred long before this. And ships, it appeared incredible that he should have seen not a single sail. He distinctly recalled the atlas he had examined prior to embarking upon his health cruise. The Pacific had been lined in all directions with the routes of long-established steamer lanes, and in between, Waldo had felt, the ocean must be dotted with the innumerable tramps that come and go between the countless ports that fringe the major sea. And yet for 3 days nothing had broken the dull monotony of the vast circle of which he was always the center and the sole occupant. In 3 days, thought Waldo, he must have covered an immense distance. And 3 more days dragged their weary lengths. The wind had died to the faintest of breezes. The canoe was just making headway, and that was all. The water was gone, the food nearly so. Waldo was suffering from lack of the former. The pitiless sun beating down upon him increased his agony. He stretched his panther skin across the stern and hid beneath it from the torrid rays. And there he lay until darkness brought relief. During the night the wind sprang up again, but this time from the west. It rose, and with it rose the sea. The man, clinging to his crude steering blade, struggled to keep the light craft straight before the wind, which was now howling fearfully while great waves, hungry and wide-jawed, raced after him like a pack of ravenous wolves. Thandar knew that the unequal struggle against the mighty forces of the elements could not endure for long. It seemed that each fierce gust of brutal wind must tear his frail boat to shreds, and yet it was the very lightness of the thing that saved it, for it rode upon the crests of waves, blown forward at terrific velocity like a feather before the hurricane. In Thandar's heart was no terror, only regret that he might never again see his mother, his father, or his Nadara. Yet the night wore on, and still he fled before the storm. The sky was overcast, the darkness was impenetrable. He imagined all about him still the same wide, tenantless circle of water, only now storm-torn and perpendicular and black, instead of peacefully horizontal and soothingly blue-green. And then, even as he was thinking this, there rose before him a thunderous booming loud above the frenzied bedlam of the storm. His boat was lifted high in air to dive head foremost into what might be a bottomless abyss for all Thandar knew. But it was not bottomless. The canoe struck something and stopped suddenly, pitching Thandar out into a boiling maelstrom. A great wave picked him up, carrying him with racehorse velocity within its crest. He felt himself hurled pitilessly upon smooth, hard sand. The water tried to drag him back, but he fought with toes and fingers, clutching at the surface of the stuff upon which he had been dropped. Then the wave abandoned him and raced swiftly back into the sea. Thandar was exhausted, but he knew that he must crawl up out of the way of the surf or be dragged back by the next roller. What he had searched for in vain through 6 long days, he had run down in the midst of a Stygian night. He had found land. Or, to be more explicit, land had got in front of him and he had run into it. He had commenced to wonder if some terrible convulsion of nature had not swallowed up all the land in the world, leaving only a waste of desolate water. He forgot his hunger and his thirst in the happiness of the knowledge that once more he was upon land. He wondered a little what land it might be. He hoped that dawn would reveal the chimneys and steeples of a nearby city. And then, exhausted, he fell into a deep sleep. It was the sun shining down into his upturned face that awoke him. He was lying upon his back beside a clump of bushes a little way above the beach. He was about to rise and survey the new world into which fate and a hurricane had hurled him, when he heard a familiar sound upon the opposite side of his bush. It was the movement of an animal creeping through long grass. Thandar, the caveman, came noiselessly to his hands and knees, peering cautiously through the intervening network of branches. What he saw sent his hand groping for his wooden sword with its fire-hardened point. There, not 5 paces from him, was a man going cautiously upon all 4s. It was the most horrible-appearing man that Thandar had ever seen. Even Thurg appeared lovely by comparison. The creature's ears were split, and heavy ornaments had dragged them down until the lobes rested upon its shoulders. The face was terribly marked with cicatrices and tattooing. The teeth were black and pointed. A headdress of long feathers waved and nodded above the hideous face. There was much tattooing upon the arms and legs and abdomen. The breasts were circled with it. In a belt about the waist lay a sword in its scabbard. In the man's hand was a long spear. The warrior was creeping stealthily upon something at Thandar's left. The latter looked in the direction the other's savage gaze was bent. Through the bushes he could barely discern a figure moving toward them along the edge of the beach. The warrior had passed him now, and Thandar stood erect, the better to obtain a view of the fellow's quarry. Now he saw it plainly, a man strangely garbed in many colors. A yellow jacket, soiled and torn, covered the upper part of his body. Strange designs, very elaborate, were embroidered upon the garment, which reached barely to the fellow's waist. Beneath was a red sash in which were stuck a long pistol and a wicked-looking knife. Baggy blue trousers reached to the bare ankles and feet. A strip of crimson cloth wound around the head completed the strange garmenture. The features of the man were Mongolian. Thandar could see the warrior pause as it became evident that the other was approaching directly toward his place of concealment, but at the last moment the unconscious quarry turned sharply to his right down upon the beach. He had discovered the wreck of Thandar's canoe and was going to investigate it. The move placed Thandar almost between the two. Suddenly the native rose to his feet. His victim's back was toward him. Grasping his spear in his left hand, he drew his wicked-looking sword and emerged cautiously from the bushes. At the same moment, the man upon the beach wheeled quickly as though suddenly warned of his danger. The native, discovered, leaped forward with raised sword. The man snatched his pistol from his belt, leveled it at the onrushing warrior, and pulled the trigger. There was a futile click. That was all. The weapon had missed fire. Instantly, a third element was projected into the fray. Thandar, seeing a more direct link with civilization in the strangely appareled Mongol than in the naked savage, leaped to the assistance of the former. With drawn sword, he rushed out upon the savage. The wild man turned at Thandar's cry, which he had given to divert the fellow's attention from his now almost helpless victim. Thandar knew nothing of the finer points of swordplay. He was ignorant of the wickedness of a Malay parang, the keen curved sword of the headhunter, so he rushed in upon the savage as he would have upon one of Thurg's near men. The very impetuosity of his attack awed the native. For a moment he stood his ground, and then, with a cry of terror, turned to flee. But he had failed to turn soon enough. Thandar was upon him. The sharp point entered his back beneath the left shoulder blade, and behind it were the weight and sinews of the caveman. With a shriek, the savage lunged forward, clutching at the cruel point that now protruded from his breast. When he touched the earth, he was dead. Thandar drew his sword from the body of the headhunter and turned toward the man he had rescued. The latter was approaching, talking excitedly. It was evident that he was thanking Thandar, but no word of his strange tongue could the American understand. Thandar shook his head to indicate that he was unfamiliar with the other's language, and then the latter dropped into pidgin English, which, while almost as unintelligible to the cultured Bostonian, still contained the battered remnants of some few words with which he was familiar. Thandar depreciated his act by means of gestures, immediately following these with signs to indicate that he was hungry and thirsty. The stranger evidently understood him, for he motioned him to follow, leading the way back along the beach in the direction from which he had come. Before starting, however, he pointed toward the wreck of Thandar's canoe, and then toward Thandar, nodding his head questioningly as if to ask if the boat belonged to the caveman. Around the end of the promontory, they came upon a little cove beside the beach, of which Thandar saw a camp of nearly a score of men, similar in appearance to his guide. These were preparing breakfast beside the partially completed hull of a rather large boat they seemed to have been building. At sight of Thandar, they looked their astonishment, but after hearing the story of their fellow, they greeted the caveman warmly, furnishing him with food and water in abundance. For 3 days, Thandar worked with these men upon their craft, picking up their story slowly, with a slow acquirement of a bowing acquaintance with the bastard tongue they used when speaking with him. He soon became aware of the fact that fate had thrown him among a band of pirates. There were Chinese, Japanese, and Malays among them, the offscourings of the South Seas, men who had become discredited even among the villainous pirates of their own lands, and had been forced to join their lots in this remoter and less lucrative field, under an unhung ruffian, Sao Ming, the Chinaman whose life Thandar had saved. He also learned that the storm that had cast him upon this shore nearly a month before had demolished their prahu, and what with the building of another and numerous skirmishes with the savages, they had had a busy time of it. Only yesterday, while a party of them had been hunting a mile or two inland, they had been attacked by savages who had killed 2 and captured 1 of their number. They told Thandar that these savages were the most ferocious of headhunters, but like the majority of their kind, preferred ambushing an unwary victim to meeting him in fair fight in the open. Thandar did not doubt but that the latter mode of warfare would have been entirely to the liking of his piratical friends, for never in his life had he dreamed, even, of so ferocious and warlike a band as was comprised in this villainous and bloodthirsty aggregation. But the constant nervous tension under which they had worked, never knowing at what instant an arrow or a lance would leap from the shades of the jungle to pierce them in the back, had reduced them to a state of fear that only a speedy departure from the island could conquer. Their boat was almost completed. 2 more days would see them safely launched upon the ocean, and Sao Ming had promised Thandar that he would carry him to a civilized port from which he could take a steamer on his return to America. Late in the afternoon of the 3rd day since his arrival among the pirates, the men were suddenly startled by the appearance of an exhausted and blood-smeared apparition amongst them. From the nearby jungle, the man had staggered to fall when halfway across the clearing, spent. It was Balloon, he who had been captured by the headhunters the day before Thandar had been cast upon the shore. Revived with food and water, the fellow told a most extraordinary tale. From the meager scraps that were afterward translated into pidgin English for Thandar, the Bostonian learned that Balloon had been dragged far inland to a village of considerable size. Here he had been placed in a room of one of the long houses to await the pleasure of the chief. It was hinted that he was to be tortured before his head was removed to grace the rafters of the chief's palace. The remarkable portion of his tale related to a strange temple to which he had been dragged and thrown at the feet of a white goddess. Sao Ming and the other pirates were much mystified by this part of the story, for Balloon insisted that the goddess was white with a mass of black hair, and that her body was covered by the pelt of a magnificent black panther. Though Sao Ming pointed out that there were no panthers upon this island, Balloon could not be shaken. He had seen with his own eyes, and he knew. Furthermore, he argued, there were no white goddesses upon the island, and yet the woman he had seen was white. When this strange tale was retold to Thandar, he could not but recall that Nadara had worn a black panther skin, but of course it could not be Nadara. That was impossible. But yet he asked for a further description of the goddess, the color of her eyes and hair, the proportions of her body, her height. To all these questions, Balloon gave replies that but caused Thandar's excitement to wax stronger. And then came the final statement that set him in a frenzy of hope and apprehension. "Upon her left hand was a great diamond," said Balloon. Thandar turned toward Sao Ming. "I go inland to the temple," he said, "to see who this white goddess may be. If you wait 2 days for me and I return, you shall have as much gold as you ask in payment. If you do not wait, repair my canoe and hide it in the bushes where the man hid who would have killed you but for Thandar." "I shall wait 3 days," replied Sao Ming, "nor will I take a single fun in pay. You saved the life of Sao Ming. That is not soon to be forgotten. I would send men with you, but they would not go. They are afraid of the headhunters. 2, will I repair your canoe, against your coming after the third day. But, and he shrugged, you will not come upon the third day, nor upon the fourth, nor ever, Thandar. It is better that you forget the foolish story of the frightened balloon and come away from this accursed land with Sao Ming. But Thandar would not relinquish his intention, and so he parted with the pirates after receiving from Balloon explicit directions for his journey toward the mysterious temple and the white goddess who might be Nadara, and yet who could not be. Straight into the tangled jungle he plunged, carrying the spear and the parang of the headhunter he had killed, and in the string about his loins one of the long pistols of a dead pirate. This latter Sao Ming had forced upon him with a supply of ammunition. End of Part 2, Chapter 10. Part 2, Chapter 11 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Gerald Moe. The Rescue. It was dusk of the second day when Thandar, following the directions given him by Balloon, came to the edge of the little clearing within which rose the dingy outlines of many long houses raised upon piles. Before the village ran a river. Many times had Thandar crossed and recrossed this stream, for he had become lost twice upon the way and had to return part way each time to pick up his trail. In the center of the village, the man could see the outlines of a loftier structure rearing its head above those of the others. As darkness fell, Thandar crept closer toward his goal, the large building which Balloon had described as the temple. Beneath the high raised houses the caveman crept, disturbing pigs and chickens as he went, but their noise was no uncommon thing, and rather than being a menace to his safety, it safeguarded him, for it hid the noise of his own advance. At last he came beneath a house nearest the temple. The moon was full and high. Her brilliant light flooded the open spaces between the buildings, casting into black darkness the shadows beneath. In one of these Thandar lurked. He saw that the temple was guarded. Before its only entrance squatted 2 warriors. How was he to pass them? He moved to the end of the shadow of the house beneath which he spied, as far from the guards as possible, but still discovery seemed certain were he to attempt to rush across the intervening space. He was at a loss as to what next to do. It seemed foolish to risk all now upon a bold advance. The time for such a risk would be when he had found the goddess and learned if she were Nadara or another. But how might he cross that strip of moonlight and enter the temple past the 2 guards without risk? He moved silently to the far end of the building, in the shadows of which he watched. For some time he stood looking across at his goal, so near and yet seemingly infinitely farther from attainment than the day he had left the coast in search of it. He noted the long poles stuck into the ground at irregular intervals about the structure. He wondered at the significance of the rude carving upon them, of the barbaric capitals sometimes topped by the headdress of a savage warrior, again by a dried and grinning skull, or perhaps the rudely chiseled likeness of a hideous human face. Upon many of the poles were hung shields, weapons, clothing, and earthenware vessels. One especially was so weighted down by its heterogeneous burden that it leaned drunkenly against the eaves of the temple. Thandar's eye followed it upward to where it touched the crudely shingled roof. The suggestion was sufficient. Where his eye had climbed, he would climb. There was only the moonlight to make the attempt perilous, if the clouds would but come. But there was no indication of clouds in the star-shot sky. He looked toward the guards. They lolled at the opposite end of the temple, only one of them being visible. The other was hidden by the angle of the building. The back of the fellow whom Thandar could see was turned toward the caveman. If they remained thus for a moment, he could reach the roof unnoticed. But then there was the danger of discovery from one of the other buildings. An occasional whiff of tobacco smoke told him that some of the men were still awake upon the verandas where most of the youths and bachelors slept. Thandar crawled to where he could see the only veranda which directly faced the portion of the temple he had chosen for his attempted entrance. For an hour he watched the rising and falling glow of the cigarettes of two of the native men and listened to the low hum of their conversation. The hour seemed to drag into an eternity, but at last the glowing butt of first one cigarette and then another was flicked over into the grass, and silence reigned upon the veranda. For half an hour longer Thandar waited. The guards before the temple still squatted as before. The one Thandar could see seemed to have fallen asleep, for his head drooped forward upon his breast. The time had come. There was no need of further delay or reconnaissance. If he was to be discovered, that would be the end of it, and it would not profit him one iota to know a second or so in advance of the alarm that he had been detected. So he did not waste time in stealthy advance, or in much looking this way and that. Instead, he moved swiftly, though silently, directly across the open, moonlit space to the foot of the leaning pole. He did not cast a glance behind, nor to the right nor left. His whole attention was riveted upon the thing in hand. Thandar had scaled the rickety, toppling saplings of the cliff-dwellers for so long that this pole offered no greater difficulties to him than would an ordinary staircase to you or me. First he tested it with eyes and hands to know that it rested securely at the top, and that beneath his weight it would not move noisily out of its present position. Assured that it seemed secure, Thandar ran up it with the noiseless celerity of a cat. Gingerly he stepped upon the roof, not knowing the manner of its construction, which might be weak thatching that would give beneath him and precipitate him into the interior beneath. To his surprise and consternation, he found that the roof was of wood, and quite as solid as one could imagine. It had been his plan to enter the temple from above, but now it seemed that he was to be thwarted, for he could not hope to cut silently through a wooden roof with his parang in the few hours that intervened before dawn. He stooped to examine the roof minutely with eyes and fingers. The moonlight was brilliant. In it he could see quite well. He pulled away the thin palm frond thatch. Beneath were shingles hand-hewn from billion. In each was a small square hole through which was passed a strip of rattan that bound the shingle to the frame of the roof. Thandar lifted away the thatching over a little space some 2 feet square. Then he inserted the point of his keen parang beneath a rattan tie-string, and an instant later had lifted aside a shingle. Another and another followed the first until an opening in the roof had been made large enough to easily admit his body. Thandar leaned over and peered into the darkness beneath. He could see nothing, His own body was between the moon and the hole in the roof, shutting out the rays of the satellite from the interior. The man lowered his legs cautiously over the edge of the hole. Feeling about, his feet came in contact with a rafter. A moment later, his whole body had disappeared within the temple. Clinging to the edge of the hole with one hand, Thandar squatted upon the rafter above the temple floor. Now that his body no longer clogged the aperture in the roof, the moonlight poured through it, throwing a brilliant flood upon a portion of the floor at the opposite side of the interior. The balance was feebly lighted by the diffused moonlight. The temple seemed to consist of a single large room. In the center was a raised platform, and also about the walls. From the rafters hung baskets containing human skulls. One swung directly in the moonlight beneath Thandar. He could see its grisly contents plainly. His eyes followed the moonlight toward the area which it touched upon the far side of the room. It reminded Waldo Emerson of a spotlight thrown from the gallery of a theater upon the stage. Directly in the center of the light, a woman lay asleep upon the platform. Thandar's heart stood still. About her figure was wrapped the glossy hide of Nagula. Over one bare brown arm billowed a wealth of thick black hair, fine as silk. Upon the third finger of the left hand blazed a large solitaire. The woman's face was turned toward the wall, but Thandar knew that he could not be mistaken. It was Nadara. From the rafter upon which he squatted to the floor below was not over 12 or 15 feet. Thandar swung downward, clinging to the rafter with his hands, and dropped, cat-like, upon his naked feet to the floor below. The almost noiseless descent was sufficient, however, to awaken the sleeper. With the quickness of a panther, she swung around and was upon her feet, facing the man almost at the instant he alighted. The moonlight was now full upon her face. Thandar rushed forward to take her in his arms. "Nadara," he whispered, "thank God." The girl shrank back. She recognized the voice and the figure, but her Thandar was dead. How could it be that he had returned from death? She was frightened. The man saw the evident terror of her action and paused. "What is the matter, Nadara?" he asked. "Don't you know me? Don't you know Thandar?" "Thandar is dead," she whispered. The man laughed. In a few words he explained that he had been stunned but not killed by the earthquake. Then he came to her side and took her in his arms. "Do I feel like a dead man?" he asked. She put her arms about his neck and drew his face down to hers. She was sobbing. Thandar's back was toward the doorway of the temple. Nadara was facing it. As she raised her eyes to his again, her face went deadly white, and she dragged and pushed him suddenly cut of the brilliant patch of moonlight. "The guard," she whispered. "I just saw something move beyond the door." Thandar stepped behind one of the tree trunks that supported the roof, looking toward the entrance. Yes, there was a man even now coming into the temple. His eyes were wide with surprise as he glanced upward toward the hole in the roof. Then he looked in the direction of the platform upon which Nadara had been sleeping. When he saw that it was empty, he ran back to the doorway and called his companion. As he did so, Thandar grasped Nadara's hand and drew her around the opposite side of the temple, where the shadows were blackest, toward the doorway. They had reached the end of the room when the two warriors came running in, jabbering excitedly. One of them had passed halfway across the temple, and Thandar and Nadara had almost reached the door when the second savage caught sight of them. With a cry of warning to his companion, he turned upon them with drawn parang. As the fellow rushed forward, Thandar drew the pistol the pirates had given him and fired point blank at the fellow's breast. With a howl, the man staggered back and collapsed upon the floor. Then his fellow rushed to the attack. Thandar had no time to reload. He handed the weapon to Nadara. "In the pouch at my right side are cartridges," he said. "Get out several of them, and when I can, I will reload." As he spoke, they had been edging toward the doorway. From the street beyond, they could already hear excited voices raised and questioning. The shot had aroused the village. Now the fellow with the parang was upon them. Thandar was clumsy with the unaccustomed weapon with which he tried to meet the attack of the skilled savage. There could have been but one outcome to the unequal struggle had not Nadara, always quick-witted and resourceful, snatched a long spear from the temple wall. As she dragged it down, there fell with it a clattering skull that broke upon the floor between the fighters. A howl of dismay and rage broke from the lips of the headhunter. This was sacrilege. The Holy of Holies had been profaned. With renewed ferocity, he leaped to close quarters with Thandar, but at the same instant Nadara lunged the sharp-pointed spear into his side. His guard dropped, and Thandar's parang fell full upon his skull. "Come," cried Nadara, "make your escape the way you came. There is no hope for you if you remain. I will tell them that the two guards fought between themselves for me, that one killed the other, and that I shot the victor to save myself. They will believe me. I will tell them that I have always had the pistol hidden beneath my robe. Goodbye, my Thandar. We cannot both escape. If you remain, we may both die. You certainly." Thandar shook his head vehemently. "We shall both go, or both die," he replied. Nadara pressed his hand. "I am glad," was all that she said. The savages were pouring from their long houses. The street before the temple was filling with them. To attempt to escape in that direction would have been but suicidal. "Is there no other exit?" asked Thandar. "There is a small window in the back of the temple," replied Nadara, "in a little room that is sometimes used as a prison for those who are to die, but it lets out into another street, which by this time is probably filled with natives." "There is the floor," cried Thandar. "We will try the floor there." He ran to the main entrance to the temple and closed the doors. Then he dragged the two corpses before them and a long wooden bench. There was no other movable thing in the temple that had any considerable weight. This done, he took Nadara's hand, and together the two ran for the little room. Here again they barricaded the door, and Thandar turned toward the floor. With his parang he pried up a board. It was laid but roughly upon the light logs that were the beams. Another was removed with equal ease, and then he lowered Nadara to the ground beneath the temple. Clinging to the piling, Thandar replaced the boards above his head before he too dropped to the ground at Nadara's side. The streets upon either side of the temple were filled with savages. They could hear them congregating before the entrance of the temple, where all was now quiet and still within. They were bolstering their courage by much shouting, to the point that would permit them to enter and investigate. They called the names of the guards, but there was no response. "Give me the pistol," said Thandar. He loaded it, keeping several cartridges ready in his hand. Then, with Nadara at his side, he crept to the back of the temple. Pigs routed from their slumbers grunted and complained. A dog growled at them. Thandar silenced it with a cut from his parang. When they reached the edge of the shadow beneath the temple, they saw that there were only a few natives upon this side of the structure, and they were hurrying rapidly toward the front of the building. 100 yards away was the jungle. Now a sudden quiet fell upon the horde before the temple doors. There was the sound of hammering, then a pushing, scraping noise, and presently shouts of savage rage. The dead bodies of the guardsmen had been discovered. Now from above came the padding of naked feet running through the temple. The street behind was momentarily deserted. "Now," whispered Thandar. He seized Nadara's hand, and together the two raced from beneath the temple out into the moonlight and across the intervening space between the long houses toward the jungle. Halfway across, a belated native, emerging from the veranda of a nearby house, saw them. He set up a terrific yell and dashed toward them. Thandar's pistol roared, and the savage dropped, but the signal had been given, and before the two reached the jungle, a screaming horde of warriors was upon their heels. Thandar was confused. He had lost his bearings since entering the village and the temple. He turned toward Nadara. "I do not know the way to the coast," he cried. The girl took his hand. "Follow me," she said, and to the memories of each leaped the recollection of the night she had led him through the forest from the cliffs of the Bad Men. Once again was Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones, the learned, indebted to the greater wisdom of the unlettered cave girl for his salvation. Unerringly, Nadara ran through the tangled jungle in the direction of the coast. Though she had been but once over the way, she followed the direct line as unerringly as though each tree was blazed and signposts marked each turn. Behind them came the noise of the pursuit, but always Nadara and Thandar fled ahead of it. Not once did it gain upon them during the long hours of flight. It was noon before they reached the coast. They came out at the camp of the pirates, but to Thandar's dismay it was deserted. Sao Ming had waited the allotted time and gone. If Thandar had but known it, the picturesque cutthroat had overstayed the promised period and had but scarce left when the fugitives emerged from the jungle beside the beach. In fact, his rude craft was but out of sight beyond the northern promontory. A pistol shot would have recalled him, but Thandar did not know it, and so he turned dejectedly to search for the hidden canoe. It lay behind the little clump of bushes that had hidden Thandar the morning that he had saved Sao Ming's life several 100 yards to the south. All signs of pursuit had now ceased, and so the two walked slowly in the direction of the craft. They found it just where Sao Ming had promised that it would be. It was well and staunchly repaired, and in addition contained a goodly supply of food and water. Thandar blessed Sao Ming, the unhung murderer. Together they dragged the frail thing to the water's edge, and were about to shove it out when, with a chorus of savage yells, a score or more of the headhunters leaped from the jungle and bore down upon them. Thandar turned to meet them with drawn pistol. "Get the canoe into the water, Nadara," he called to the girl. "I will hold them off until it is launched. Then we may be able to reach deep water before they can overtake us." Nadara struggled with the unwieldy boat, which the rollers picked up and hurled back upon her each time she essayed to launch it. From the corner of his eye, Thandar saw the difficulties that the girl was having. Already the horde was halfway across the beach, running rapidly toward them. The man feared to fire except at close range, since his unfamiliarity with firearms rendered him an extremely poor shot. However, it was evident that Nadara could not launch the thing alone, and so Thandar turned his pistol upon the approaching savages, pulled the trigger, and wheeled to assist the girl. More by chance than skill, the bullet lodged in the body of the foremost headhunter. The fellow rolled screaming to the sand, and as one, his companions came to a sudden halt. But seeing that Thandar was busy with the boat, and not appearing to intend to follow up his shot, they presently resumed the charge. Thandar and Nadara were having all that they could attend to with the canoe, and so the savages came to the water's edge before they realized their proximity. When he saw them, Thandar wheeled and fired again. Then, taking the canoe up bodily above his head, he struggled out through the surf, Nadara walking by his side, steadying him. After them came the savages, perhaps half a dozen of the bolder, when suddenly a great roller caught them all, pursuers and pursued, sweeping them out into deep water. Thandar and Nadara clung to the canoe, but the headhunters were dragged down by the undertow. Upon the beach, yelling, threatening, and gesticulating, danced 30 or 40 baffled savages. But now Thandar and Nadara had crawled into the craft, which the outgoing tide was carrying rapidly from shore, and with the aid of the paddle were soon safely out upon the bosom of the Pacific. Safely. End of Part 2, Chapter 11. Part 2, Chapter 12 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Gerald Moe. Pirates. As the tide and wind carried the light craft out to sea, and the shoreline sank beneath the horizon behind them, Waldo Emerson looked out upon the future as he did upon the tumbling waste of desolate water encircling them, with utter hopelessness. Once before he had passed by a miracle through the many-sided menaces of the sea, but that he should be so fortunate again he could not hope. And now Nadara was with him. Before, only his own suffering and death had been possible. Now he must face the greater agony of witnessing Nadara's. The wind, blowing a steady gale, was raising a considerable sea. The vast billows rolled one upon the heels of another, with the regularity of infantry units doubling at review. The wind and the sea seemed to have been made to order for the frail vessel that bore Thandar and Nadara. It rode the long, ponderous waves like a cork. Its crude sail caught the wind and bellied bravely to it, driving the boat swiftly over the water. And scarce had the shore behind them sunk forever from their sight, than dead ahead another shoreline showed. Thandar could scarce believe his eyes. He rubbed them and looked again. Then he asked Nadara to look. "What is that ahead?" he asked. The girl half rose with an exclamation of joy. "Land!" she cried. And land it was. The wind, driving them madly, carried them toward the north end of what appeared to be a large island. angry breakers pounded a rocky coastline. To strike there would mean instant death to them both. But would they strike? As they neared the point of the island, it became evident to Thandar that they would be borne past it. Could he hope to stem the speed of the little craft and turn it back into the sheltered water in the lee of the land? The chances were more than even that the canoe would capsize the instant he cut away the sail and attempted to paddle across the wind, as would be necessary to come about the end of the island. But there seemed no other way. He handed his parang to Nadara, telling her to be ready to cut the rawhide strips that supported the sail the instant that he gave the word. With his paddle clutched tightly in his hands, he knelt in the stern, watching the progress of the canoe past the rocky point. At this extremity of the island, a narrow tongue of land ran far out into the sea. It was past the outer point of this tongue that the canoe was racing. When they had passed, Thandar realized the rashness of attempting to turn the canoe into the trough of the sea, even for the little distance that would have been necessary to make the shelter of the point, where, almost within reach, he could see the peaceful bosom of unruffled water lying safely behind the island. And yet, as he looked ahead upon the limitless waste of ocean before them, he knew that one risk was no greater than the other, and then an alternative plan occurred to him. He would run a short distance past the point, and then turn almost directly back and attempt to paddle the canoe in the calm water, running nearly into the face of the wind, thus avoiding the dangers of the trough. There was but a single drawback to this plan, the question of his ability to drive the canoe against the gale. At least it was worth trying. He gave Nadara the word to cut down the sail, and at the same instant, the canoe being upon the crest of a wave, he bent to the paddle. As the panther skin tumbled at the foot of the rough mast, the nose of the craft swung around in reply to Thandar's vigorous strokes. So intent were both upon the life-and-death struggle that they were waging with the elements that neither saw the long, low-lying craft that shot from the mouth of a small harbor behind them as they came into view upon the lee side of the island. For a moment the canoe hung broadside to the wind. Thandar struggled frantically to carry it about. Down they dropped into the trough of a great sea. Above them hung the overleaning tower of the wave's crest, ready to topple upon them its tons of water. The canoe rose, still broadside, almost to the crest of the wave, then the thing broke upon them. When Thandar came to the surface, his first thought was for Nadara. He looked about as he shook the water from his eyes. Almost at his side, Nadara's head rose from the sea. As her eyes met his, a smile touched her lips. "This is better," she shouted. "Now we can reach shore." And turning back, she struck out for land. Just behind her swam Thandar. He knew that Nadara was like a fish in water, but he doubted her ability, as he doubted his own, to reach the shore in the face of both wind and tide. A wave carried them high in air, and from its crest both saw simultaneously a long craft in the hollow beneath them, and noted the fierce aspect of her crew. Nadara, fearing all men but Thandar, would have attempted to elude the craft, but the glimpse that the man had had of those aboard her had convinced him that he had fallen by good fortune into the company of Sao Ming and his crew. "They are friends," he screamed to Nadara, and so they let the boat come alongside and pick them up. But no sooner had Thandar obtained a good look at the occupants than he discovered that never a face among them had he seen before. They were of the same type as Sao Ming's motley horde, nor did Waldo Emerson need inquire their vocation. Thief and murderer were writ upon every countenance. They jabbered questions at Nadara and Thandar in an assortment of dialects which neither could understand, and it was only after the craft had been anchored in the little bay and the party had waded to shore that Thandar tried speaking with them in pidgin English. Several among them understood him, and he was not long in making it plain to them that they would be paid well if they carried him and Nadara to a civilized port. The leader, who seemed to be a full-blooded Negro, laughed at him, ridiculing the idea that an almost naked man could pay for his liberty. At the same time, the fellow cast such greedy glances at Nadara that Thandar became convinced that the fellow, for reasons of his own, preferred not to believe that they could pay in money for their liberty. It seemed that the party had been about to embark for another portion of the western coast of the island, where the main body of the horde lay. They had but been waiting for 3 of their crew who had gone inland hunting, when they had seen the canoe and put out to capture its occupants. Now they returned to the little harbor to pick up their fellows and continue toward the main camp. The black was for dispatching Thandar at once, as their boat was already overcrowded, but there were others who counseled him against it, reminding him of the probable anger of their chief, who saw only in a dead prisoner the loss of a possible ransom. At last the hunters returned, and all embarked. Soon the boat had passed out of the bay and was making its way south along the west coast of the island. It was almost dark when her nose was turned toward shore and the long sweeps brought into play as the sails sagged to the foot of the mast. Between 2 small, overlapping points that hid what lay behind, they passed into a landlocked harbor. As the boat breasted the end of the inner point, Thandar sprang to his feet with a cry of joy and amazement. Not 100 yards away, riding quietly upon the mirror-like surface of the water, lay the Priscilla. The pirates looked at their prisoner in astonishment. The black rose with clenched fists as though prepared to strike him. "Priscilla, ahoy!" shrieked Waldo Emerson. "Help! Help!" The Negro grinned. There was no response from the white yacht. Then the men told Thandar that they had captured the vessel several weeks before and were holding her crew prisoners upon land, awaiting the return of the chief, who had been unaccountably absent for a long time. When Waldo Emerson told them that the yacht belonged to his father, the black was glad that he had not killed him, for he should bring a fat ransom. It was dark when they landed, and Thandar and Nadara were forced into squalid huts that lay side by side with several others just above the beach. For a long time the man could not sleep. His mind was occupied with doubts as to the fate of his father and mother. Nadara had told him that both had been aboard the Priscilla. She had said nothing of the treatment accorded her by Mrs. Smith-Jones, but Waldo had guessed near the truth, and he had seen that the sight of the Priscilla had awakened no enthusiasm or happiness in the girl. After a while he dozed, only to be awakened by the sound of movement outside his hut. There was something sinister in the stealthiness of the sound. Silently Thandar rose and crept to the door. The pirates had made no attempt to secure their prisoners. There was no possibility of their escaping from the island. Thandar put his head out into the lesser darkness of the night. He muttered a little growl of rage and fear, for what he saw was the huge, dark bulk of a man crawling into Nadara's hut. Instantly the American followed. At the door of the girl's shelter he paused to listen. Within he heard a sudden exclamation of fright and the sound of a scuffle. Then he was within the darkness, and a moment later stumbled against a man. Thandar's fingers sought the throat. He made no sound. The other wheeled upon him with a knife. Thandar had expected it. His forearm warded the first blow, and running down the forearm of the other, his hand found the knife wrist. Then commenced the struggle within the Stygian blackness of the interior of the hut. Back and forth across the mud floor the two staggered and reeled, the one attempting to wrench free the hand that held the knife, the other seeking a hold upon the throat of his antagonist while he strove to maintain his grip upon the other's wrist. The heavy breathing of the two rose and fell upon the silence of the night. That and the scuffling of their feet were the only sounds of combat. Nadara could not assist Thandar. She knew that it was he who had come to her rescue, though she could not see him. At last, with a superhuman effort, the night prowler broke away from Thandar. For a moment silence reigned in the hut. None of the three could see the other. From beneath his panther skin, Thandar drew the long pistol that Sao Ming had given him, but he dared not fire for fear of hitting Nadara. Nor dared he ask her to speak that he might know her position, for then would he have divulged his own to his antagonist. For minutes that seemed hours, the three stood in utter silence, endeavoring to stifle their breathing. Then Thandar heard a cautious movement upon the opposite side of the room. Was it his foe or Nadara? He raised the pistol level with a man's breast, and then very cautiously he too moved to one side. At the slight sound of his movement there came a sudden flash and deafening roar from across the hut. The enemy had fired, and in the flash of his gun all within the interior was lighted for an instant, and Thandar saw the giant black not 2 paces from him, and to the man's left stood Nadara, safe from a shot from Thandar's pistol. The black, not knowing that Thandar was armed, had not guessed that his chance shot was to prove his own death messenger. The instant that the flash of the other's gun revealed his whereabouts, Thandar's pistol gave an answering roar, and simultaneously Thandar leaped to one side, running swiftly to grapple with the black from the side. But when he came to him, instead of meeting with ferocious resistance, as he had expected, he stumbled over his dead body. But now the whole camp was awake. The pirates were running hither and thither, shouting questions and orders in their many tongues. Confusion reigned supreme, and in the midst of it, Thandar grasped Nadara's hand and ran from the hut. Back of the other huts he ran until he had passed the end of the camp. Then he turned down toward the water. It was his intention to reach a boat and make his way to the Priscilla. Behind them the confusion of the camp grew as the pirates searched the huts for an explanation of the 2 shots. There could have been no better opportunity for escape. Drawn up upon the beach was one of the Priscilla's own boats. Together Thandar and Nadara pushed it off, and a moment later were rowing rapidly toward the yacht. It was with a feeling of unbounded security and elation that Waldo Emerson clambered over the side and drew Nadara after him, but his elation was short-lived, for scarcely had he set foot upon the deck than he was seized from behind by 6 brawny villains who had been upon guard on board the Priscilla and had seen the 2 put off from the shore, watched their flight toward the yacht, and lain in wait for them as they clambered over the side. The balance of the night they were kept prisoners upon the Priscilla, but early the next morning they were taken ashore. There they found all the pirates congregated outside one of the huts. Within were the passengers and crew of the Priscilla. As Thandar and Nadara approached, they were seized and hustled toward the doorway. With an accompaniment of oriental oaths, they were pushed into the interior. Standing about in disconsolate and unhappy groups were the crew of the Priscilla, Captain Burlingham, and Mr. and Mrs. Smith-Jones. As his eyes fell upon the last, Waldo Emerson ran toward her with outstretched arms. With a horrified shriek, Mrs. Smith-Jones dodged behind her husband and the captain. Waldo came to a sudden halt. The two men eyed him threateningly. He looked straight into his father's face. "Don't you know me, father?" he asked. John Alden Smith-Jones's jaw dropped. "Waldo Emerson," he cried. "It cannot be possible." Mrs. Smith-Jones emerged from retreat. "Waldo Emerson," she echoed. "It cannot be." "But it is, mother," cried the young man. "What awful a peril," said Mrs. Smith-Jones after she had embraced her son. Then her eyes wandered to Nadara, who had been standing in demure silence just within the doorway. "You," she gasped, "you are not dead?" Nadara shook her head, and Waldo Emerson hastened to recount her adventures since Stark's attack upon her on the deck of the Priscilla. Mrs. Smith-Jones approached the girl. She placed a hand upon her shoulder. "I have been doing a great deal of thinking since last I saw you," she said, "and the result of it is that I am going to do something that I have never before done in my life. I am going to ask your pardon. I treated you shamefully. I do not need to ask if my son loves you. You have already told me that you love him, and his eyes have told me where his heart lies. For long nights I lay awake thinking of the horror of it, and almost praying that he might be dead rather than come back to find you waiting for him in Boston. That was before you went overboard. You had no birth or family, and that to me meant everything, but since I thought that you were both dead, I discovered that I recalled many things about you that were infinitely to be preferred over birth and breeding. I cannot tell you just what they are, only I cannot blame my son for loving you. Only you must discard that horrible garment for something presentable." "Mother," shouted Waldo Emerson as he threw his arms about her, "I knew that you would love her too, if you ever knew her." Just then the door opened, and one of the pirates entered. "Come," he said. They filed out past him. From those outside they learned that it had been decided to kill them all, and after looting the Priscilla, sink her, as a man-of-war had been sighted cruising off the coast early in the morning. In their terror they had decided to wait no longer for the absent chief, and all thoughts of ransom were forgotten in the mad desire to erase every vestige of their piracy. The victims looked at one another in horror. They were entirely surrounded by the pirates, and one by one were securely bound that there might be no chance of any escaping. The plan was to lead them inland to the densest part of the jungle, and there to cut their throats and leave their corpses to the vultures. The pirates appeared to derive much pleasure in recounting their plan to the prisoners. At last all were bound, and the death march commenced. The last of the long line of hope-forsaken prisoners and brutal, gibing cutthroats had disappeared in the jungle when a rude craft made its way into the harbor. At sight of the Priscilla it hesitated and prepared to fly, but seeing no sign of life aboard it, approached, and finding the decks deserted, mounted. In the cabins the newcomers discovered 2 Malays asleep. These they awoke with much laughter and rude jests. The 2 guards leaped to their feet, feeling for their pistols, but when they saw who had surprised them, they grinned broadly and jabbered volubly. They addressed all their remarks to a huge and villainous fellow whom they called Chief. He it was whom the pirates had awaited, and whose prolonged absence had resulted in the determination to execute the prisoners of the Priscilla. When the chief learned of what was going on in the jungle, he cursed and bellowed in rage. He saw many thousand liangs of Psyche evaporating before his eyes. Shouting orders to his fellows to follow him, he leaped into the craft that had brought them to the Priscilla, and a moment later was pushing rapidly toward the shore. Without waiting to draw the boat upon the beach, the chief plunged into the jungle, his men at his heels. Far ahead of him trudged the weary and fear-sickened prisoners, lashed onwards with sticks and the flats of murderous parangs. At last the pirates halted in a tangled mass of vegetation. "Here," said one, but another thought they should proceed a little further. For a few minutes the two men argued, then the first drew his parang and advanced upon Thandar. "Here," he insisted, and swung the blade about his head. A sudden crashing of the underbrush and loud and angry shouts caused him to turn his eyes in the direction of the interruption. The prisoners, too, looked. What they saw was not particularly reassuring. Only another very ferocious appearing and exceedingly wrathful pirate, followed by half a dozen other villains. He rushed into the midst of the group, knocking men to right and left. The wicked-looking fellows who had bullied and cowed the frightened prisoners but a few moments before now looked the picture of abject terror. The chief came to a halt before the man with the bared parang. His face was livid and working spasmodically with rage and excitement. He tried to speak, and then he turned his eyes upon Thandar, standing there bound ready for decapitation. As his gaze fell upon this prisoner, his eyes went wide, and then he turned upon the would-be executioner, and with a mighty blow felled him. That seemed to loose his tongue, and from his mouth flowed a torrent of the most awful abuse the prisoners had ever heard. It was directed toward the men who had dared contemplate this thing without his sanction, and principally against the cowering unfortunate who had not dared to rise from where his chief's heavy fist had sprawled him. "And you would have killed Thandar," he shrieked, "Thandar who saved my life." And then he fell to kicking the prostrate man until Thandar himself was forced to intercede in the wretch's behalf. With the coming of Sao Ming, the troubles of the prisoners evaporated in thin air. For when he found that the owner of the Priscilla was Thandar's father, he restored the yacht and all the loot that his men had taken from it to their rightful owners. Nor would he have stopped there had they permitted him to have his way, which was no less than to behead half a dozen of his unfortunate lieutenants who had been overzealous in the performance of their piratical duties. Sao Ming's picturesque villains replenished the water casks of the Priscilla and carried aboard her a sufficient stock of provisions to ensure her company a plentiful table to Honolulu, the port they had chosen as their first stop. And when the preparations were completed, a dozen piratical prahus escorted the white yacht 100 miles upon her northward journey, firing a farewell salute with a volley after volley from the little brass 6-pounders in their bows. As the tiny fleet diminished to mere specks astern, disappearing beneath the southern horizon, a white-flanneled man with close-cropped blonde hair and a slender, black-haired girl in simple shirt-waist and duck skirt watched them from the deck of the Priscilla. An involuntary sigh escaped the lips of each, and they turned and looked into one another's eyes. "We are leaving a cruel world that has been kind to us," said the man, "for with all its cruelties it gave us each other and reunited us when we were separated." "Will civilization be more kind?" asked the girl. Thandar shook his head. "I do not know," he replied. End of Part 2, Chapter 12. Part 2, Chapter 13 of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Gerald Moe. Homeward Bound. At Honolulu, Waldo Emerson Smith-Jones and Nadara were married. Before the ceremony, there had been some discussion as to what name should be used in describing Nadara in the formal contract. Nadara alone seemed too brief and meaningless to the precise Mrs. Smith-Jones, but Waldo Emerson and the girl insisted that it was her name and all sufficient. So, in lieu of another name, it was finally decided by all that Nadara could not be legally improved upon. Prior to the ceremony, which took place on board the Priscilla, Mr. and Mrs. John Alden Smith-Jones, Captain Cecil Burlingham, several invited guests from amongst officials and friends in Honolulu, and the crew of the Priscilla presented gifts to the bride. Captain Burlingham, in presenting his, proffered a few words in explanation of it. "To you, Nadara," he said, "these trinkets will hold a deeper meaning and a greater value than to another, for they come from your own forgotten island, where they lay for 20 years until, by chance, I picked them up close by the sea. The poor lady to whom they once belonged you never knew. It is quite possible that she never was upon your savage coast, and how her jewels came there must always remain a mystery. But two things you hold in common with her, for she was a lady and she was very beautiful." He held toward Nadara in his open palm a little worn bag of the skins of small rodents sewn together with bits of gut. At sight of it, both the girl and Waldo Emerson exclaimed in astonishment. Nadara took the bag wonderingly in her hands and dumped the contents into her palm. Waldo pressed forward. "Do you know to whom those belonged?" he asked Burlingham. "To Eugenie Marie Celeste de la Valois, Countess of Circe," replied the captain. "They belonged to Nadara's mother," returned Waldo. "Her foster parents were present at her birth, and took these jewels from the poor woman's body after she had passed away. She was washed ashore in a boat in which there was only a dead man beside herself. Nadara was born that night." And so, when the clergyman had performed the marriage ceremony, he entered upon the certificate and the space provided there for the name of the woman, Nadara de la Valois. And they are living in Boston now in a wonderful home that you have seen if you ever have been to Boston and been driven about in one of those great sightseeing motor buses, for the place is pointed out to all visitors because of the beauty of its architecture and the fame that attaches to the historic and aristocratic name of its owner, which, as it happens, is not Smith-Jones at all. End of Part 2, Chapter 13. End of The Cave Girl by Edgar Rice Burroughs.